to explain predictive modified behavior. For those who looked at what the ancients in Africa knew was the enlivenment and illumination of the soul. So today, I want to talk again about critical race theory, but in real life. In reviewing of last time, I got some requests to have a follow-up in the discussion of critical race theory. So I'm going to review Dr. Derek Bell's quote, the late professor who really began the strong study in legal scholarship on critical race theory. And he says, courage is a decision you make to act in a way that works through your own fear for the greater good as opposed to pure self-interest. Courage means putting at risk your immediate self-interest for what you believe is right. I'm going to add a couple other quotes here. The first one is from a song that I really enjoy by Sweet Honey and the Rock, and it says, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." The next quote, I attribute it to one of my first supervisors when I was a young school psychologist, and it says, "The price for freedom is eternal vigilance." Once again, the price for freedom is eternal vigilance. And my first supervisor, Dr. Judy McBride, is the one who shared that with me. So I have some psychology news here. And it's from a June 19th article in the New Yorker written by Benjamin Wallace Wells. And the title of the article is How a Conservative Activist Invented the Conflict Over Critical Race Theory. And I'm quoting from the article here. Holding a large meeting on Zoom often required emailing supporting notes and materials, more documents to leak. Before the pandemic, if you thought that an anti-racism seminar at your workplace had gone awry, you had to be both brave and sneaky to record it. At home, it was much easier. Zoom allowed you to record and take screenshots, and if you were worried that such actions could be traced, you could use your cell phone or your spouse's cell phone or your friends. So here's how the discussion began during the shutdown. So folks have been, and many people at different jobs and job situations have been required to take diversity trainings or inclusion trainings or, trainings about sexuality, gender, but people have at times expressed their discomfort to just downright frustration with the political leanings of presenters. That's what the article in the New Yorker has talked about, but that access during the shutdown and ability to share the information has been important in spreading the word. Well, author Tim Wise, who's nearby me in the state of Tennessee, just north of Alabama here, he goes on to suggest that by spending time trying to tell people what critical race theory is, people are wasting time and not focusing on the real ends of the fight against critical race theory. Because the motives of those who are against critical race theory are usually focused on a broader and what Wise suggests is a more sinister idea. And that idea is minority inferiority and anti-blackness specifically. So in the critical race theory, at least the article that was written by Tim Wise is titled this way: Is critical race theory racist against white people? And here's some of the words of Tim Wise, and I'm going to respond to them, but I'm going to read them to you first. By suggesting that the country is systematically unjust, they argue CRT is rooted in a rejection of the United States as a good and great nation. And by insisting upon the existence of white privilege as a social and economic reality, CRT is, they say, racist against white people. And Wise is here talking about people who are against critical race theory. Let me go on to look at Wise's words here. But amid the uproar over anti-racist scholarship, equity trainings, and the movement for Black lives, one important thing has been overlooked. If disparities in labor markets, education, housing, and the justice system are not the result of deeply embedded systemic racism, there is only one possible answer. If the problem isn't America, then it must be black people. I'll say that again. If disparities in labor markets, education, housing, and the justice system are not the result of deeply embedded systemic racism, there is only one possible answer. If the problem is in America, then it must be black people. Now I'm going to pause here because Wise's writings, and even in his writing in this particular article, refers back to a time in the mid-1990s where there was a discussion about the bell curve. And now the discussion wasn't new. The book and the ideas were not new. They were talking about an inferiority of certain classes of people who tend to score low on IQ tests. But what was new or broader was the idea that people needed to be placed in certain camps, that policy needed to be developed to address these people, their inferiority. Not policy that addressed the systemic and legal discrimination that was encouraged by the state, whether it was a particular state within the United States or the federal government encouraging discrimination. We weren't going to address that in these books. We were going to address the problem as lying within the people. Now, there's still some pure psychologists who believe that the problem lies with the learner specifically. I would posit that the challenge is both within society, and society often changes the learner. We've largely solved the nature versus nurture debate in that the environment as well as internal factors influence how people do in life. I'm talking about education, I'm talking about health outcomes, I'm talking about overall career success. So that's usually what we're thinking about in schools, that's what we're thinking about if we're working with young people who are having psychological and mental health issues. But man, if we're not looking at the environment in which people live, it's like trying to grow plants in isolation. It's trying to grow a plant that should be in the earth and the water, right? We at least need to account for the environment. That's just my take on it. And I'm sure many others, if you've read ecosystemic psychology, ecological psychology, even evolutionary psychology to some degree. So I'm going to share a couple of stories and then we'll wrap up with some recommendations. But the first story here was about me and my assumptions as a trainer of diversity, right? I'm either teaching or going to school districts or going to companies and talking to people about diversity. And when I started teaching at the graduate level 20 years ago and doing these trainings, I assumed, especially if people had my same skin tone or grew up in neighborhoods similar to me, that the people thought like me. Oh boy, was I wrong. So what I did learn to do is take time to get to know my audience and what they wanted out of the trainings, as well as what the organization needed to accomplish during the trainings. And what I found in my experience, often the organization and people differ on some or all of the objectives of such diversity trainings. So time to discuss what those objectives are and what's of interest for the participants is never wasted time. I think diversity trainers run into challenges, particularly when they're talking about changing behavior, right? When they don't really listen to the people who are in their audience. In my experience, it's been better to let people listen, discuss, and then pose their own questions rather than assume that they see all the things the same. And that's likely what was happening in the training where a conservative author and activist was upset by the diversity training, and he took that outside of the Zoom session. So the next story has to do with my parents, right? And some people don't always think that, well, this critical race theory doesn't happen in real life. But for me, it has happened in real life. Whether it was the diversity trainings and learning about how to present the information, but also now I'm thinking about times in my life and times in people's day-to-day lives where the idea of access to property and critical race theory is happening. So my parents were raised one generation away from poverty. And they did not drink or smoke, and they intentionally saved their money, and that usually other people would maybe spend, but they saved it to buy a house. And they were able to buy a house outright by making a substantial down payment during the late 80s, despite an economic recession. Here's where the issue comes in. A white realtor was upset that my parents' black skin could bring down the property values. The woman even tried to take tiles that my parents had purchased and were being put into the home by some local church friends. But fortunately, the tradesmen who were putting in the tiles stopped her and they called the police. Right? This woman was just going to throw tiles out that my parents were going to put in the home. Like some black people have done, my parents had a white friend represent them in their further dealings with the realtor, and they were able to keep their home, which they really should not have had to defend, but desperate times call for the use of critical race theory. Again, property rights, access. So if you didn't hear the prior podcast that I did on critical race theory, I would suggest you go back and check that out. So if you're thinking like this is some like isolated event or whatever, yeah, it's not. So you can look up stories on famous people like Bill Russell, the NBA champion, or Jackie Robinson, the Major League Baseball champion and person who integrated baseball, or the late mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, when each of them tried to buy a home while black. And in particular, Tom Bradley, like my parents, enlisted the help of white friends to buy his first home in Los Angeles. And he was a police officer, moving on to city council and later became a mayor. Like, he had these issues. These things will come right up if you Google them. Just Google these names and housing discrimination, right? Again, access to property, access to whiteness and connecting with that. And there's examples of white privilege and people like Bill Russell, Jackie Robinson, who was a conservative Republican, by the way, and Mayor Tom Bradley, who was a conservative Democrat, if you believe there was such a thing back in the day. But they all needed help from their friends, right? They all needed to trade on this sense of privilege. Man. So what do we do with all this? Let me leave some recommendations for you again. Remember this, that education, laws, health practice that deem people inferior and then assign them to an unequal or inequitable practice or status is not good practice. Again, laws, health practices, educational practices that deem people inferior and assign them to an unequal or inequitable status should be stopped. And it's not always white people who do this. There are many others. Remember, next, that most significant battles for progress in the USA are about property rights, not human rights. It is great to keep a scorecard around better behavior, but America's really about access to property, intellectual, services, a building, a land, a title. All these things are important to have. For those who are doing things on diversity, and this is the third recommendation, remember vocabulary is important, but also if you want to change mind, is it good to do an assessment before assuming everyone believes what you believe as a trainer. All should take time for trainees to process new information. If you're doing a training, give people time to process that new information. As it is, this will prepare them for how to apply what they are learning in the field rather than keep it all in the classroom or Zoom session. Finally, if you're a psychologist, educator, or concerned citizen, have courage. These issues are not easy to discuss, but they are important to address, and as you continue to strive towards a more perfect union. All right. Thanks again for tuning in to the podcast here. If you are interested in more content, you can find us at the Gold Doctor, and golddoctor.net is my other page. You can also find that at drbrandongamble.com. You can take a look at our Black History podcast, or you can follow me on Facebook, Spotify, Spreaker, or YouTube. Join me next time as we discuss the latest in this psychologist's mind. Have a great day.